Welcome. Welcome to our conversation. I'm looking forward to this very much. This is a conversation with Cliff Adams, and Cliff will tell his story, and we'll talk about stories, and who knows where the conversation will go. We hope that you will feel a part of the story and this conversation because it's your story. That's our emphasis. Every story is important, and we just need to find them. And Cliff has found many stories, and some that are really crucial to his life. So, Cliff, we often start with back when we were children and who was the storyteller in your life, and so we're not going to do that. Why don't you just start by talking about some of the most recent discoveries? And you have a great word. It's one of my favorite words, epiphany. I love epiphany. So it's all yours.
Well, the epiphany, which I love that word too, but that word came up from attending a story circle, and hearing people talk about stories, and me starting to think about, okay, I would like to have a story, but I didn't want it to be anecdotal, just not connected to something. And then I've been going to the vet center. You can see I'm a veteran, and I went for 25 years not paying any attention, sort of having my status of being a veteran in the closet. So now I tell my partner that I need to balance my karma, so I need to have my an advertising for 25 years. But I was been going to the vet center, and I was at the vet center and had a real epiphany about something that related to my service, and August Hutchinson, who we both know, that great Middlebury College student who's been running the Moth Up things. He when I mentioned it at story circle, he said, "Gee, you ought to tell that story," and then that got me going to actually work on forming the story. And so I formed my first, the story that I recently been doing around that epiphany. And it was great because it gave me a hook sort of to hang the story on. It's funny you say that, a lot of times we start with childhood stuff. There's the big thing with me is when I was a kid, I've been reminded that I was a storyteller. And my childhood friend said to me, and she said, you told scary stories sometimes, and she said, we always thought that they were true because you were scared too. So, and so do that. But
you were good.
But it must have been, But it's the surprising thing is, and the biggest thing for me with telling stories now, is a connection that I've made to my childhood time.
Tell us about that.
Well, when I came back from Vietnam, when I actually went to Vietnam, before I went to Vietnam, and I tell this in a story that I've performed, I was at Castleton State College, and we were arguing about the war. It was 1967. There were 500,000 troops in Vietnam at the time. 15,000 already been killed, 109,000 wounded, and there were also in 1967 100,000 protesters against the war in Washington, D.C. And so I went to college in '67, and we were arguing about the war a lot, and nobody really knew too much, but was it right, was it wrong? And the way I phrase it in my story is, I had a brilliant idea. I'll go to Vietnam and find out what's really going on.
A brilliant idea. Okay.
And then the story that I tell says, do you know how when you tip a domino over, the others seem to fall right in line?
Yeah.
And so my second brilliant idea was, if I was going to go and find out what's really going on, I better get good training. So the last domino, I joined the Marines. But anyway, I went to Vietnam, and part of it was that the idea that when I really know what's going on, I'll be able to say what I want to say and speak from a position of authority. You know, at the time, if you recall, back in the 60s, there was quite a bit of division between the hippie generation and the older generation,
Oh, yes.
and you know, they said, you know, they didn't want to hear you if your hair was something, and so I figured if I was a veteran, then they'd have to listen to you. The thing I didn't know was when I came back, as my family had said later when we finally did talk about it, they said they were all anxious to hear something. I said nothing. You know, like so many veterans, when I came back, I was absolutely silent. You know, wasn't talking about a thing. And what I didn't understand, though, was at the time that I thought that even though I'd been there and I was a combat Marine and we were in the jungle a lot and stuff like that, I didn't realize that I was suffering from post-traumatic stress because I thought nothing happened to me. You know, I mean, I had things blow up in the night, but you know, there was no classic Hollywood war stuff with people being shot next to you and all that kind of stuff. So I thought, well, there was no effect for me on it. Well, there was an effect, and that effect really had silenced me from wanting to talk about the experience. And you know, that's just so common because all the wars that we've had, people don't tell the stories of it because it's not safe. It's not safe to tell a story of war amongst people who haven't been to war because the stories can be really pretty terrible and sound terrible, and the person telling it doesn't want to be judged. You know, they've a lot of times been injured by what they've seen or done. So, you know, so the stories stay buried. World War II was notorious for that. You know, how many people never heard stories from their family that was in World War II ever, or sometimes until the person was in their 90s, or really,
or until they found that one or two little mementos or souvenirs that came back
that would bring it back
and bring the memory back.
And you know, the reason for that, there was a wonderful guy that Martin Casey. Did you know him?
I know the name.
He's passed on. He was part of the Legion in Virgins. Martin was a wonderful guy, and in theater, and but he served in World War II in both theaters. And Martin, he helped me out with a project that we did with a play that I wrote about Vietnam. And it was interesting because he could talk with me. Because he knew I was a veteran, even though our experiences were vastly different. And the thing that struck me is, in his conversations, I could see in him the same thing that I could see in myself, was that there were certain memories that even though they were 25, in his case, they were 45, 50 years ago, but they were so fresh. They were like yesterday. And you know, that's what happens in any sort of traumatic situation. It's sort of like the memory will imprint upon you. And that's actually where stories come in, because healing from that sort of thing always involves being able to put the story in the proper perspective. You know, that yes, that happened, and that was really bad what happened, but it also happened 25, 35, 50 years ago. Don't need to react like it's happening now, even though the memory's that fresh. And Martin was really good with that. But the thing was for me is that I never understood that I had any sort of effect from the war, but I wasn't talking about it until I ended up putting an exhibit of photos, part of a school project, on my restaurant in Virgins, and then Vietnam and my war experience came right out, tumbled out of the closet, and that embarked a whole new direction for me in studying. But I continued my the counseling and the vet service and understanding these things. And like I said, I wrote this play. The play was about Odysseus from the Odyssey. And when I read Odysseus, which a professor recommended I do when I was having a lot of trouble in the school program, and he said, you need to read that because I was really in turmoil with the thing, and I'd been married and divorced, and couldn't understand what I was feeling, and the reading the Odyssey let me understand that what I was feeling was not actually being home. I was back in Vermont, but I had not returned in many ways, and that's what happens to a lot of veterans. That
it was different.
It was different, and more importantly, I was different, and so I was so different that when I got back to my home,
which was easier or harder to realize that the situation was different or that you were different?
I think it was probably harder for me to realize, not that I was different, but to realize how I was different.
Okay, which was
what? How I was different was that I could no longer look at my home the way that I looked at it before. So before, things that might have seemed to be really important, after I had the experience of life and death and war, all of a sudden I couldn't fathom. What really happened is that when this just dawned on me just now. Maybe it was an epiphany.
Go there.
Maybe it's epiphany. But when I was at war, I felt like that was unreal, and that going back home would be going back to reality, And the strange thing is, when I got home, then it felt like home was unreal, and my war experience was the only thing that was real. So that's the.
But you didn't talk about it.
Didn't talk about it. No stories.
So it was inside.
It was inside, and it stayed there. And
how long did it stay there?
Well, literally. I mean, I came back in 1969. I went back to school in 1993. So there's 25 years, 24, 5 years. And then I started to focus on it, but still, I think it was maybe 2004, 2005. That when I really came into the acknowledgement of, okay, this is what's going on. I learned a lot about post-traumatic stress, and then I came to understand that, okay, people had it. I didn't think I had it, because I didn't think that I had, I knew that I had the same symptom that most people have with it in combat. It's a minimizing thing.
What does that mean, minimize?
What it means is that everybody feels that they have nothing to complain about because it could have been worse.
Okay.
Well, I got shot at, but I never got hit. Well, I got hit, but I only got hit in the arm. I lost a limb, but it was only a leg. And then I lost only 2 legs. All the way. I understood that to such a point where I used to joke about it and used to say, "What do I have to complain about? I didn't even get killed." It's sort of like the only way that you could be justifiably have something to say is when you weren't able to say anything because you were dead. So it was, but I was minimizing, that I did it, and I finally though came down to understand it, to understand that it had affected me, and one of the symptoms, and this ties into my current storytelling. One of the symptoms that I really understood and troubled me, and still troubles me, but not so much after my epiphany. Troubled me. One of the symptoms of a post-traumatic stress thing is what they term foreshortened future.
Okay.
Foreshortened future just means that when you look into the future, you just don't see anything. And for years and years, that was it for me.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't that I saw gloom or doom.
Mm-hmm.
I just, and it wasn't that I wouldn't be involved in something. I was involved at a number of businesses, but there was never a future. I just did my stuff, and if somebody looked and said, well, what's your goals for 5 years from now? It's like, I didn't see any 5 years from now,
Mm-hmm.
and that foreshortened future thing really did turn out to be something that troubled me the most, because I sort of, whenever I'd run into normal depression or
Mm-hmm.
down times, not having a future to look forward to, doesn't help from getting out of those situations. Can make them worse. So,
Yeah, one person I talked to said that the future was expectation that it would continue just as it is, that you don't think much about it. That doesn't square with you.
well, no, in a sense it does, but it was sort of like that things would continue, but I just didn't see anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like I didn't see them changing in any way.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see them doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of funny to explain that I just didn't see anything,
Mm-hmm.
anything in the future.
So you have found a number of, or found some people who've been part of helping to look at finding your story, but also you've been using the arts and plays and stories and
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about
Well,
that?
that's I think that's the thing that tells us how organic and necessary stories are,
Mhm.
because we'll do it without instruction or without
Mhm.
motive. When I read the Odyssey and I was in the middle of turmoil with the uncovering Vietnam experience, and I literally. It literally felt like that story was speaking to me.
Mhm.
I mean, I was reading it, and so then what I did was I wrote a play, which wasn't very good, but dramatically it wasn't,
Yeah.
But I wrote a play that involved me calling out across the ages to Odysseus from the Odyssey.
Mhm.
Pray tell, old soldier, what wisdom do you have from your 3,000-year-old perspective to tell me about getting home from war? Because in reality, even though the Odyssey is used for all kinds of stuff, it's a story about a soldier trying to get home from war.
Mhm. Mhm.
And and if you look at it in modern terms, the things that he describes in the story that Homer has describes are post-traumatic stress symptoms.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, I'm talking with Odysseus and I'm saying, and he's telling me, he says, well, you use psychology, but we use the gods,
Mhm.
to tell the story, but it's the same thing. What you're talking about is going to war and coming home.
Your play was performed?
We actually performed it. We performed it and had two characters. One was me playing myself, and the other was John Ball. I don't know if you know John. Wonderful guy. And John's very striking looking, he the beard and everything, and he played Odysseus. And we performed it about a half a dozen.
And you recently told your story at the college in the Moth-Up.
Yeah, in the
Can you
Moth-Up.
talk about that?
That story, and that's the one that followed the Epiphany.
Mhm.
The Epiphany that I had about something that happened in the service, and the theme for the night at the Moth-Up was neighbors,
Mhm.
good neighbors, bad neighbors, and stuff. And the epiphany that I had was I was at my new counselor, whose name is Odysseus.
Oh.
Odysseus, if you can figure that.
No.
Yeah,
no. We won't.
No,
touch
but
that.
his name is Odysseus Manzi. Odysseus Manzi, wonderful guy.
Yeah.
And we had a thing, and I was talking to him about relationships, and I said, my relationship, which has now been 20 years, is really going well, but I said the bottom still falls out, and I said the old sort of tapes start playing, and he said, well, what are those tapes about? And I said, well, and the tapes were, it's never gonna work, and cursing this and that and everything, and he said, whoa, he said, well, he asked me, whose voice is that? Because my voice had changed, my body language had changed, everything had changed. He said, and I said, I stopped to think, like, well, whose voice was it? And the epiphany was the voice came from my drill instructor in boot camp in the Marine Corps. And so it was
that much of an impact.
That much of an impact. So so my story, the story that I ended up fashioning and telling, it comes out to be that for 48 years, I've had this neighbor from hell living inside my head. And how that once I understand that, then
he's out of your head.
Well, at least I can start doing something to clean up the neighborhood.
That's a good way to put it.
Been doing too much to think that there are there are solutions, but usually they're incremental and they take a lot of time.
I like that.
So that formed that story, and that brought me back. And the important thing about that is, by telling that story and forming that story, and this I think is really important for veterans. I'm going to work some with veterans on this. What I did was I have bridged the gap that has been really present in my life since 1969 to 2016. I don't even want to do that math, but that's a long time. I think 48 years would. But by touching back to that, and the key to healing from traumatic injury, in any case, is being able to get back in touch with what your life before that, so that you can bring that life sort of forward. And that's what I've done. By telling that story, it's connected me to somewhat of the storyteller before he went into service and stopped telling any stories.
I was just reading a really good article by a psychiatrist on working with children in trauma. And they say a lot. He said a line similar to what you just said, and that is that the only person who really can tell, knows when it's the time to tell the story is the person who's had the trauma. And you need to listen and be patient and wait until they're ready to tell that story, rather than to try to direct it.
Or pull it out. And and that, of course, that's very true with children, but even with adults, the thing is, people in the helping professions, like the counselors and stuff like that, what they do is they realize that it does need to be that person. What you do is you make the situation right. Try to make it safe enough, try to lead them to the point. And so I've been doing counseling for 30 years, and but none of it actually got there until I sort of have this epiphany. And that didn't solve everything, but the exciting thing about it is now I'm interested in telling stories. Before I wasn't. As soon as I came back from the service and stopped for the most part.
Well, what have you learned by becoming a performer?
Well, becoming a performer, technically, I've learned that there's something to be said for craft and practice, but the biggest thing for me personally I guess it is becoming a performer, because that's what I'm doing with the story. I told the story in public, and I'm telling it in public again this weekend in Barrie. But the biggest thing for me that's happened is that I've connected to the myself before my military experience. So I think that and that's a uniquely personal thing to happen. But what I've also though learned is gotten more clear on just how important stories are. How important it really is to and I must say true stories too. You know, that's there's a big move on that with the moth and all these things today, but of telling stories, but telling true stories. So when the people who are listening to them, they know this is a true story. So I,
I think that the whole concept of being able to be transparent, to be able to be open, and I don't know what other words you put to those, but that all that becomes part of who we are as a human being, and that makes it the healing possible, because we're doing that and we're not hiding or pushing down or pushing back something that wants to get out.
Well, you know, one of the real important words about storytelling is vulnerability. When we tell something about ourselves, we're becoming vulnerable. And the important thing, healing-wise and in many other ways with the vulnerability, is becoming vulnerable opens the door for connection with us, with other people.
C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite writers, said, to love at all is to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
You know, you don't love unless you're willing to be vulnerable. And story opens up that.
Well, you know, there's
kind of possibility.
There's a wonderful researcher, Brené Brown, B-R-E-N-E, who does a TED Talk on vulnerability, and it's a wonderful talk. And she said, she asked the audience, when everybody thinks of vulnerability, we can have a tendency to think about weakness. And she said, yes, but when you saw somebody up here being vulnerable, how many of you thought that was this really strong, brave thing to do? And everybody raised their hand. You know, we can think of it ourselves as being something that's not, that might be weakening, but everybody who sees, if you're being vulnerable, you're being very brave, because you're opening yourself for connection.
Any words of encouragement for people who say, I don't have a story, or
well, you know, I've come with that. When you see about, you know, I listened to some moth talks, and somebody says, well, when Armstrong said, well, when I stepped on the moon, and you think, well, boy, how can I compete with that? You know? but the reality is, you know, when I had this little epiphany, the reality is our lives are stories. Our whole lives are stories, and all we need to do is to be willing to look at them, maybe jot some things down, and maybe share them with some of the people that are in our lives, and you'll find that there's a lot more that's connected to that than you may have realized.
That's a good way for us to kind of set this conversation in motion, hoping that those of you who have been out there in television land, we all live in television land now, have joined us, have enjoyed this conversation, and have begun to think about your own story. We thank Cliff for being a part of this conversation today, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you.